Today we are at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford and meet with Nicholas Burnett, eminent paper and conservation expert. Nicholas, thank you for having us. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
We joined the private sector 30 years ago, so we're Museum Conservation Services Limited, and we've expanded from just works of art on paper to historic photographs as well. And date-wise, it ranges from the sort of 15th century all the way up to completely contemporary artworks and photographs.
Tell us about photography in the 1880s. It was a fairly new medium still then.
The first commercially successful photographic process, the first process that really worked, was the daguerreotype process. And this was announced in 1839. Very slow. The first commercial studio wasn't opened until the start of 1841, and that was when portraiture became practical. But before that, it was too slow for portraiture. Even in 1841, if you had your portrait taken, they would clamp your head in place because of the time it took. 30 seconds, 40 seconds, a minute. That's why you very seldom see people smiling in these early photographs, because holding a smile and not making it look stiff for 30 seconds or a minute is really hard. And then in 1851, you have an Englishman, Frederick Scott Archer, who works out a process using a glass plate negative, the wet collodion process. And at the same time, they started making photographs, positive prints with egg white, the albumin print process. And this is a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, a lot easier, and photography really, it sort of explodes the amount of people doing photography, the number of commercial studios, but you're still having to make your own photographic materials. You're having to pour your emulsion onto your plate, you're having to prepare your own paper, do your own printing and everything. But in 1880, around about 1880, the gelatin dry plate is introduced, and you could buy your negative material ready to use. That's when photography really becomes popular. And then through the sort of the latter part of the 19th century, people then started using film negatives, which is lighter than glass as well, and much more flexible, less likely to break.
What's the earliest photograph in the UK, the earliest known photograph?
The earliest known surviving photograph is from the middle of the 1830s, William Henry Fox Talbot, and it's a photograph of a leaded glass window at Laycock Abbey, which was where he was living. And he was experimenting with photography throughout the 1830s, and it was when Daguerre announced the daguerreotype process, but without any details of how the process worked, that Talbot then went public with his own invention. Louis-Jacques Daguerre was the first person to announce photography, so he gets credit for that, but it was a dead end. So technically Daguerre, he's the inventor, but Talbot is seen as the father of modern photography because he was using a positive negative process.
We live in an age of photography. Digital photography is everywhere. There's website, there's apps, there's Instagram, there's TikTok, there is Pinterest. How does that differ to Victorian times?
Oh, it's radically different. Around about the time when these photographs were taken, you had to get your negative, get your negative material, put it in your camera, take your exposure. Then you had to develop the thing to produce an image. There was a latent image, it was invisible, you put it into your developer, and then you had to fix it to stop it darkening, dry your negative. That produces a negative image, not a positive image. You then have to print that with photographic paper that reverses it to a positive. You also then have to fix your positive image as well. So it's a lot of time, a lot of involvement. But unlike today's camera phones, where you just hold it up, press a button, and you've got the image, you can see it straight away. And if you don't like it, you can take another one, you can move and do a different angle. It took a lot of commitment, a lot of time if you were taking a photograph. And with a camera phone, you can take 100 shots if you want. With these old cameras, with a roll film, it might be only 12 or 24 exposures. So with the trouble it took to produce the end result and the limited number of exposures, people were quite careful in how they framed their photographs, what images they took. They couldn't just go snap, 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 snap.
Who would have had cameras, or was there a professional photographer you would employ for certain occasions?
Cameras by this date were quite affordable. also people would go to commercial photographers. So there were professional photographers from very early on. 1841, Richard Beard set up his photographic establishment, taking daguerreotype portraits. Each one cost about the same as an average labourer's annual wage. You have a thing called cartomania, where you have cartes de visite from the 1850s onwards, these little portraits. In fact, I've got one in that drawer that hasn't been cut. I'll show it to you if you hold on a moment. There it is. These are usually mounted on card, but this one was never cut. So there you are, you can see she's had a portrait done.
Yeah. It's interesting, the different movements here, and
Yes.
she tries out different postures. And
It's really from 1880 onwards, when it becomes so much easier to do your own photography, that it becomes much more widespread, becomes a popular pastime.
Nicholas, today we have these. Almost everybody has a smartphone, different versions of it. What would the Victorian have used?
It would have been very different. They would use something like this. This is a camera of approximately the right period. It takes photographs. It doesn't have your diary, it doesn't access the internet, which of course they didn't have then. All it does, it takes photographs, and a limited number of photographs at that. So you had a roll of film in here. It might be 12 exposures or 24 exposures. Once that was finished, well, you either had to put another roll of film in or you were done for the day. I mean, that's about the size of 10, smartphones. So it was not as convenient, not as easy.
You mentioned, coming back to what you said before, different techniques and different types of how photography could be produced. And I guess our collection also has a variety of different types. What types are there? How do you recognize them?
Well, there's a huge number of different techniques, some much more common than others, some very rare and obscure ones. And the most common techniques are fairly easy to recognise, but some of them some of the more unusual ones you have to start using analytical techniques on. So if I show you these albumin prints, you can see the highlights have gone yellow, and that's very characteristic of albumin paper.
This is also very topical because it also shows divers, like we had them at Tower Bridge 40 years later, I would say.
Well, this is 1856, so yes, just about 40 years before. This is the Royal Engineers. If you want an image that is going to be more stable, that's not going to decay, people started using platinum for printing. So this is platinum salts instead of silver salts. And in the 19th century, platinum wasn't particularly valuable. It only went up in value early in the 20th century.
So when you have these typical sepia-coloured photographs, they are normally based on albumin then?
So when you have your sepia photographs, it can be albumin, but it can also be a collodion emulsion that's holding the silver, or it could be a gelatin emulsion that's holding the silver. So this is a gelatin photograph, and yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it?
That's pretty. That's beans.
Beans, yeah, beautifully photographed though. See, this is not just snap it with your mobile phone. He's arranged these 5 pods. They're all very similar length. A little bit of the foliage around it, very carefully, beautifully composed. It's by a chap called Charles Jones.
What date is that?
This is about 1905, I think.
And so different to digital photography nowadays, which is so much simpler.
It is. It's so much simpler. But how many of those images actually get printed out on paper?
True.
They're very... that's a big concern because digital images are very ephemeral.
Nicholas, at Tower Bridge, we very quickly understood the historical significance of this collection, but we then reached out to you as the expert in the field to advise us. What makes these photographs so special for you?
Well, they're a unique point in time. They're not just photographs of the bridge. It's just before it opens. The workmen are still there. This was just something that you either were there capturing it at the moment or you weren't. If you weren't, it's gone forever, you know. And they're very informal as well. They're quite interesting. Formal photographs can be very interesting, but they can also be very dull, whereas the more candid, you know, chap with the camera just snapping people working, snapping what's going on day to day, and of course the public waiting for the bridge to be opened. That's unusual, that's exciting, that's capture a particular moment. Very rare as well, this sort of thing, you know, very rare. Lots of landscape photographs, lots of general photographs with the bridge in. But if you see, for example, this image here, there we go. You've got this man walking and the wind has caught his coat. That's an exposure that's a fraction of a second. It wasn't possible sort of 40, 50 years earlier. You're not going to stumble across photographs of the final stages of the construction work and the testing and the opening. It's, oh gosh, I can't think of any other institution that's got any photographs of it. And I've worked with hundreds of institutions. I've seen millions of photographs. I've never come across stuff like this. You get it for other events, of course, but Tower Bridge, as far as I'm aware, these are pretty much unique.
How did you go about treating our treasure, our collection?
Most of them, fortunately, they're not on board. It was a case of just removing a bit of surface dirt very carefully and then digitising the images. And we use a very special high-resolution scanner because we want to be able to blow them up, but also you want a good tonal range as well. There was some where there was a little bit of damage, where the corners had got a bit rubbed and the paper was starting to separate. So we consolidated those with a little bit of very pure wheat starch. And with some of them, there were scratches on the surface and the scanner picked up the scratches. So you have to retouch the scratches digitally. But the original still has the scratches, of course. But it's amazing what you can do in terms of image restoration. But you still need to keep the originals.
Okay, Nicholas, thank you very much for your time today. And also thank you for helping us with your expertise, bringing this exhibition together and bringing it to the public.
Dirk, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's so interesting. I'm so lucky. It's such a good job.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.